we're going to get started now. This is being recorded. As soon as we're done here, I will load it up and send you out an email. And if you want to watch it later, you're welcome to send it to friends. But just for us here, my name's Casey Kula. I'm the State Forest Policy Coordinator for Oregon Wild, which really means I think about forests all the time and how we should handle them. And you're here for this week's webcast on clear cuts and drinking water. And I'm really glad that you made it. So I'm joined today by Dr. Julia Jones, who's the Distinguished Professor of Geography at Oregon State University. And she'll be presenting on something that's very near and dear to our hearts here at Oregon Wild, which is drinking water and the forests of the Pacific Northwest. And then I'll talk a little bit in a questions and answers about what we're doing at Oregon Wild to protect drinking watersheds. You can ask your questions at any time. There's a question and answer function and the chat are both available to me. We usually get a flood of questions right at the end of the presentation. So the sooner you can get them in, the easier it is for me to organize and get them answered. And then we'll have ample time for questions. So part of this is that if you purchased a raffle ticket when you signed up, we really appreciate it. Your support allows us to continue doing these presentations. The raffle is open through the evening. So after the presentation, if you decide you want to enter, you can do that by finding the event on the Oregon Wild homepage and then clicking on it and purchasing a ticket. And winners will be selected tomorrow, and we'll be contacting you by email to verify your shipping address. All right, you're still with me? All right. We have a lot of new people joining us for the presentation, so a quick introduction to Oregon Wild. We're a statewide conservation and advocacy organization that's for the past 50 years has been focused on safeguarding Oregon's wild lands, wildlife, ancient forests, and waterways. And we rely upon passionate people like you to be involved in our work, whether it's advocating for wild and scenic rivers, defending old growth forests. And I know that some of you, I can see your names, have been doing that for generations, or being a voice for native wildlife. And if you want to know more about our work, visit oregonwild.org. And we'll have a new website very soon. Now, before we go any further with introduction to Dr. Jones and her talk, we need to acknowledge that we're on lands that were stolen by force from the original people of what we now call Oregon, whose descendants comprise both the 9 federally recognized tribes in Oregon, as well as tribes in neighboring states and indigenous people who are not members of tribes, neither federally recognized nor non-recognized. And this includes our public lands, but also our cities and our farms and our ranches and our businesses that are all located on unceded lands that were never given to us or to our government. And we might talk about, we will talk about lands today and living communities and values that have been core to indigenous people in Oregon since time immemorial. And we don't speak for them. And they have their own stories that are theirs uniquely to tell and to share. They're still here with us. And while a land acknowledgement, which is what that is, doesn't right historical wrongs, at Oregon Wild, we are committed to doing our best to create and foster genuine relationships that help us to create a better future for all of us who call this place home. And now I'm honored to introduce Dr. Julia Jones. Dr. Jones is the Distinguished Professor of Geography at Oregon State University, as I already noted. But Dr. Jones studies long-term effects of climate, forest management, and disturbance on streamflow, biochemistry, and ecology, both in Oregon, elsewhere in North America, and in South America. And Dr. Jones has authored papers on forest hydrology, the hydrology of road interactions with streams, water resources engineering, geomorphology, wood and streams, landscape disturbance, soils, plant invasions, biogeography, plant ecology, ecosystem water use, species distribution modeling, and climate change. And she's also worked closely with the U.S. National Science Foundation sponsored Long-Term Ecological Research Network. So we're very excited to have you join us, Dr. Jones, and the floor is yours for your presentation today.
Great. Thank you so much, Casey, and thank you to Oregon Wild for the introduction. Everything okay with the audio? People can hear me okay? So
you sound great.
So I chose to title my talk Hydrology of a Changing Forest Landscape in the Pacific Northwest. And while much of my talk will focus on the last 75 years or so, we will also be talking about forests that began to grow 500 years ago when there were no Europeans and only indigenous people present in our landscape. So the outline of my talk is really about how hydrology is changing as forests, climate, and society are changing. And I'm going to talk about the past, where there were extensive post wildfire forest stands, including much old growth forest. I'll talk about the legacies of past practices, specifically old growth clear cutting and forest plantation establishment in the latter half of the past century. I'll talk about recent and present practices, including forest reserves on federal land, where there's also increasing wildfire, and short rotation intensive forestry on private land. And then I'll conjecture a little bit about future forests, what species, what ages, what values, what products, from a perspective of thinking about how these might affect water. So I'd like to start by putting us in geographic context. The map on the right is a map of the whole Columbia River Basin. The blue dots are locations of dams, reasonably large sized dams. There are over 600 of them. The black polygons are subbasins of the Columbia River Basin. And the dark blue dots are places where we were able to find long-term streamflow gauging records from 1950 to 2012, where we could look at how streamflow has changed above dams and below dams. And the graph on the left shows that in these 25 locations shown by these numbered dark blue dots, stream flow in the May to October time period is declining. And it is also declining below dams, but not so much, indicating potentially some compensation by water resource managers to these trends. There are many hypotheses about why these trends are occurring. A sort of popular one is, oh, this is climate change, because here on the west side of Oregon, which I'm wiggling with my cursor with the Willamette Valley, we're in the rain dominated or rain and snow dominated zone with a lot of water. But over here in the eastern part of the Columbia River Basin, a lot of the runoff is from snow and snowmelt. So that's one possible explanation for these long-term trends. But there are also long-term trends in warmer summers, which could mean that plants use more water. And there have also been long-term trends in land use, in particular intensive forestry. So all of these factors may be contributors to these bigger patterns. In order to really understand how forest characteristics affect runoff, the most convincing way to do it is to use a paired watershed experiment. So there are 3 long-term paired watershed studies in Oregon that have been underway and continued since about the 1950s or 1960s into the 20 teens or currently. One is in the Alsea area. This is on private and state land. One and 2 others are in U.S. Forest Service experimental forests, the Andrews Experimental Forest and the South Umpqua Experimental Forest. So let's talk a little bit about old growth forests, which we inherited from previous climate episodes. And these are forests that were regenerated after widespread fire about 500 years ago, similar to the fires we experienced in 2020, except they must have affected the entire region. But in the early 1960s, when these photos were taken, this is a typical scene within old growth forests. And the old growth forests are really amazing because of the amount of carbon that they store. They're great high levels of biological diversity, and as we'll see, their capacity to regulate water. So, why are old growth forests so good at regulating water? And I'll talk more about this, what we know about this. But if you look at this lovely drawing of an old growth tree, and you imagine multiple of them in an old growth stand, old growth forests reflect 500 years of forest stand development in a climate, our marine West Coast climate, which has very wet winters and extremely dry summers. And so our forest stands have adapted to these conditions. And the very high leaf area of these big old trees allows them to intercept a lot of the precipitation that arrives at low intensity and evaporate it from their leaves. And that moderates flooding. The trees also contribute to a very porous forest floor and soils with a high infiltration capacity, which detains water and limits flooding. It slows it down and also limits surface erosion. And also, we're learning that these old trees have needles which have very strong stomatal control, meaning that when it gets hot and dry, they can shut down their evapotranspiration, so they don't use very much water in the summertime. Here's a graph that sort of shows some of this. Uh, I will have to take you through it. The x-axis is months or days of the year and what's called a water year from the beginning of October to the end of September. And the y-axis is the average values over a 50-year period for each day of the year for precipitation here in light blue and runoff in dark blue and water use by the forest in the green. Those are the lines we're going to pay attention to. So you can see that in our part of the world, the west side of Oregon, most of our precipitation arrives in the wintertime, and then it tails off gradually through the summer, and we have very low precipitation in the summer. And then runoff responds to precipitation, and it also gets very low in the summer, and that continues into the fall. And then the old growth forests, it appears, do a lot of their water using not during the summertime or in the middle of the winter, but during the fall when it's warm, when it's getting wetter, but also cooler, and in the spring when it's getting drier, but also warmer. So from long-term paired watershed experiments, we have learned that clear cutting of old growth forest with roads without any riparian buffers, which were the standard practices of the 50s and 60s and into the 70s, increased peak flows and floods, led to a short-term increase in summer or dry season flows, and produced a lot of high increase in the rate of landslides, especially from roads and also from clear cuts. And then as we watched these over time, as the forest plantations grew, we discovered that as the forest plantations grew older, the summer low flows declined, and in some cases, even the annual water flow declined. So here's what old growth logging looked like in the Andrews Forest in 1951. These black and white photos were taken to document the logging practices of the day. And you can see in the upper left corner of the right photo, you can see it where a road has been constructed. You can see logging slash being dumped into a stream. And then in the left-hand photo, you can see the tremendous amount of logging slash that's produced when you clear cut an old growth forest. And on the right, you can see the charring of this material after slash burning, which was a common practice of the day. So about that time, in the very early 1950s, researchers with the US Forest Service decided to establish long-term paired watershed experiments to understand the effects of these changes in forestry on water. And these paired watershed experiments are still going today. And this is a picture of a flume, which is a place for measuring water. And it's a picture of Jerry Franklin measuring flow in the stream, probably in the late 50s or early 1960s. And I'd like to point out that these kind of long-term experiments require an incredible amount of patience and institutional persistence, and they involve multiple generations of researchers working on them. So here's a picture that sort of shows what a paired watershed experiment really does. On the left, we have um, the treated watershed before treatment and the control watershed before treatment. So you pick two or more watersheds and you instrument them to measure stream flow. And you measure stream flow ideally for 5 or 10 years before you do anything. And this is what the forest probably looked like. This is what the forest looked like in these two watersheds before any treatment was conducted. Then one of the watersheds was clear cut. And here's a photograph from 1966 after the clear cutting was completed in one of the watersheds, but the other watershed was left undisturbed. And then the stream flow measurements continue, and you examine how the relationship between the two watersheds that was established in the pre-treatment period, how it changes as the forest in the treated watershed changes over time. So here's a sample of results from that kind of an experiment. And again, I'm going to take you through this graph, I hope, in a way that will help you understand it. Along the x-axis, we have, as in the previous graph I showed, the day of the water year from the beginning of October to the end of September. And on the y-axis, we have how the runoff in the treated watershed changed as a percent of the runoff in the untreated old forest watershed. So if you think about that, if there's no change in the relationship, this value is going to look like 0. And it's going to be somewhere in between these two black lines, which describe the pre-treatment relationship between the two watersheds when they were both in old forest. And what you can see here is that when you clear cut old forests with no riparian buffer, in relative terms, the thing that changes the most is the summer flow, which triples or something like that. But then within a few years, as shrubs regenerate, the green line shows how the stream flow is beginning to decline because the shrubs are starting to use that water. But then, because we kept watching for 50 years, we discovered, somewhat to our surprise, that by the time we got out a few decades where the trees were 35 to 45 years old, in the summertime, the planted forest was yielding 50 to 75% less water than the old growth forest. Why does this happen? Well, it happens for a number of reasons that relate to the water needs of growing trees and are still characteristic of much of our forested lands where trees are being grown on short rotation. Today, this short rotation forestry is limited to private lands, and the federal lands do not have short rotation plantations, but I'll talk about that in a minute. So under short rotation forestry, for much of the growing time, the trees are far enough spaced that they have fairly abundant light, they have a lot of water, they have less leaf area than old trees, than the old growth trees they replaced. So water can make it into the soil, and they evapotranspire less, so you get wetter soils, higher floods. Because of the forestry treatments, including roads and soil compaction, that can lead to surface erosion or landslides. And because these trees are young and growing rapidly, They do not close their stomata and stop evapotranspiring when it gets hot and dry. They just keep on sucking water out of the soil, especially in the summertime. Now, on public lands, on US Forest Service lands, where clear cutting of old growth happened, especially in the 1950s to the 1980s, and plantations were established during that period, much of the young forest on public lands is plantations that are now 35 to 70 years old, and they look kind of like this diagram on the right-hand side. The trees have gotten very tall, they're densely packed. They've lost most of their leaf area down below, and the leaf area is concentrated at the top of the canopies. There's a lot of competition for light, but they're still growing rapidly, and so they still utilize a fair amount of water in the summertime. So that's what we've learned from our past experiments of replacing old growth forest with planted forests. But what about today? Well, today on the public lands in Oregon and Washington, uh, old forests are largely limited to only public lands. But on public lands, maybe a quarter or a third of the area is plantations, as I mentioned, established in the 1950s to the 1980s, whereas on private lands, which may be industrial forestry or family forestry, or increasingly many of the private lands are managed by asset management companies like JP Morgan, we have intensive plantation forestry with short rotations of Douglas fir. So what do these places look like? Here are some photos from the old growth forest in the Andrews. And you can see a histogram on the left-hand side that shows the distribution of numbers of trees by diameter. And you can see that many of the trees exceed 50 centimeters or even a meter in diameter. There's a range of different sizes and heights and leaf area at different levels of the canopy. In contrast, here is an old forest plantation. This one is about 60 or 70 years old, established in the mid 1960s. And here you can see that my diagram showed, the trees are very tall and very close together. Their leaf area is at the top. There's not much growing. In the understory, you can see the stumps of the trees that were cut from the old growth stand. And most of the trees are less than half a meter in diameter. That's public lands. But now, if we move, most of us live in a landscape with private industrial or private family forestry or other private forestry operations. And so we live in a landscape which is a mosaic of clear cuts, young planted forests, and forests that are about to be logged. So what happens to water in those kinds of landscapes? What kind of water yield are we seeing? Well, in places that are in forests of 25 to 30 years of age, we know those forests are delivering a lot less water and we know this from our long-term paired watershed experiments. And the long-term paired watershed experiments across Oregon all pretty much show the same thing, which is, again, let's look at this graph and think about what it's showing. On the x-axis is the day of the water year. And as before, on the y-axis, we're seeing the percent change in water yield relative to old growth forest. So for example, this red line here says that in a Douglas fir plantation, 40 to 53 years old, in the Alsea area of the Coast Range, on most days of the year, that plantation is delivering quite a bit less water than an old forest watershed is yielding, as much as 50% less, especially in the summer. And we see that in the Andrews Forest, the deficits are mostly confined to the summertime. That's the green line in the Cascades. But then as we move south in the Cascades into the South Umpqua, um, a paired watershed experiment there shows that a 40-year-old forest plantation there is producing less water almost throughout the year compared to the reference old growth watershed. So that's where we are today. But our landscape continues to change. So many things are changing. One of the things that's changing is the plans for a forest accord. And the forest accord will obligate the preservation of forest in riparian buffers on smaller streams than have hitherto been protected, for example, by the Oregon State Forest Practice Rules. Climate change is bringing us significantly hotter and also drier summers. And we're getting a bunch more wildfire, which is affecting a number of attributes of our forest. A lot of the wildfires are burning in mature and old growth forest, but those fires are being fought. And so much of the area that ends up burned isn't from the original fire, it's from the fire fighting. And then after the fire is eventually extinguished, usually by rain, there may be salvage logging and there may or may not be post-fire replanting of trees. And then we can see some differences, some effects of forest age and forest condition on the susceptibility of a forest stand to burning. So let's talk first about the forest accord. So this is a photograph, or I'm going to show you several photographs from the Coast Range. This is the LC paired watershed experiment, and this watershed is called Needle Branch. It's on private land. And it was originally logged in the 1960s, and then it grew up to be a 45 or so year old plantation. And then and then a few years ago, it was logged, but a riparian buffer was retained. So the riparian buffer is shown by this line of trees. It only occupies less than 3% of the area of the watershed, but it contains densely spaced Douglas fir trees that were planted in the 1960s. Here's another view looking down on it. You can see also that there's some alder. This was winter photograph. So there's some alder in the riparian zone. And on the hill slope, you can see the little baby trees starting to grow that were replanted. And here's another view of that riparian buffer in the left-hand side of the photograph. So it's a very narrow strip of trees. So the question is, when this watershed was clear cut, remember, I told you when we clear cut old growth forests with no riparian buffers, we got a big increase in summer stream flow, 300% increase. What happens when you clear cut a 45-year-old plantation and you leave a riparian buffer? Well, if you look at the graph on the right-hand side, you will see what happened, which is, again, we have on the x-axis the day of the year, and on the y-axis, you have the percent change in water yield after the treatment. And this pink line and the orange line tell you that even though 97% of the watershed was clear cut, the watershed is still producing about 50%, 25 to 50% less water in the summertime, just because of those trees that are left in the riparian zone. They're preserving that summer deficit. And this is, so the riparian buffer policy has the potential to preserve water deficits in the summertime, which is a little bit of a perverse consequence, not what was intended, I think. At the same time, we also know from paired watershed experiments that the hotter or drier the summer, the less flow you will get from a plantation forest. So this graph on the x-axis shows how wet it was from very dry to wetter in the summertime. And on the y-axis, it shows how many more days of extreme low flow extreme low flows you got in the planted forest. And the fact that these lines go up from the right to the left means as it gets drier, the watershed with the planted forest is getting drier and drier relative to the old growth forest. So this comes back to this diagram or this map that I showed you at the beginning. There may be some kind of multi-decade effect of land cover changes in our whole Columbia River Basin with an intensification of industrial plantation forestry. That may be one of many factors that's contributing to declining summer flows throughout the Pacific Northwest. And finally, here's the wildfire story. Um, These are photographs from the Andrews Forest where the Lookout fire burned last summer, started on August 5th and finally was extinguished by rain in October. And on the left-hand photograph, you see the Lookout Creek Old Growth Trail, which was open to the public, and you can see that the fire burned through the old growth forest. It was carried perhaps by lichens and other fuels up into the forest canopy, killing many, though not all, of the old trees. But if you look through the forest, you can see that beyond that, across the stream, is a relatively flat area with one of these 70-year-old forest plantations where the fire also burned, but it did not burn the canopy. And here on the right is a photograph of another part of the Andrews Forest where fire burned at high severity and killed pretty much everything, whether it was old growth forest or plantations. And so if we think about it, it's really stunning how our landscape has changed in the last 75 years. On the left-hand side, I bring back this photo of what the old growth forest looked like in the Andrews 75 years ago. And then here in the middle, I show another photo from 1951 of a particular clear cut where they put in the road. Here's the logging slash and the stumps. And then this was planted. And then the right-hand photograph is that same place, which we visited last November after the fire. And if you look beyond these people, you can see a little bit of black because the fire burned through this plantation. But because there's no fuel and the fire was not being blown by very high winds like in 2020, the trees pretty much all survived. That's the public lands. But here's the private lands situation. This is a picture taken right after the Holiday Farm fire, a little further downstream in the Mackenzie Valley on land which is now managed or owned by JP Morgan and was Campbell Global. These were plantations aged anywhere from 0 to 30 years. They burned at high intensity. Everything died. There was a little bit of salvage logging. There has been very little replanting. And here's a picture of that same area from a different angle taken last December. And it's really stunning to think that here is a lot of private land where the trees were burned. In most cases, in that far background and in this near background, they didn't even bother to salvage log. And in the intermediate background, they salvage logged, and those areas have probably been replanted. So this raises a whole bunch of questions about how might present and future forest conditions affect water. There is a chance that extending riparian buffers into smaller streams, while they bring many benefits with respect to shade and temperature, they could also preserve summer low flow reductions. Climate change is likely to continue to bring us hotter and potentially drier summers, and combined with intensive forestry is likely also to reduce summer stream flow, which is the time of year when our landscape and our cities and our streams are water limited. But on the other hand, wildfire and post-fire treatments are likely to increase water yield temporarily. So I am not going to make any recommendations about forest policy or advocacy, but here are some things that I wonder about. You know, um, there has been a lot of discussion about think about what is in the riparian buffer, right? If it's a bunch of densely planted Douglas fir trees, might there be an argument for doing some thinning in riparian buffer zones? Um, Wildfire. Well, you know, when the firefighters were in the Andrews Forest last summer, supposedly fighting the fire, their efforts were entirely focused on protecting the structures, the buildings where we do the research. And the firefighters were referring to our old growth forest as, oh, there's a lot of weeds out there. We got to clear out the weeds. So it's clear that firefighters are not educated about ecological characteristics of our forests. And it would be helpful if firefighters included an objective of protecting certain ecosystem attributes as well as people and property. On public lands, it is likely that there will continue to be logging in the form of thinning in old plantations, but there is no current logging of old growth, except that if it burns, then the firefighters are in there, they're cutting down trees left and right, anything they consider to be a danger tree. And so that is something that deserves some consideration. And then finally, climate and wildfire on private forest land. Might there be some reason to consider longer rotations to reduce susceptibility to fire, store more carbon, and maybe provide more salvage value if that forest burns? So, what am I wondering about? Well, generally, I wonder in my research what are the trade offs among these different values we get from forests, which include but aren't limited to carbon, biodiversity, flood protection, and sustained water yield, not to mention forest bathing and the capacity to just go out and be in an old forest. Um, I wonder how water yield will change over the longer term in burned forests, which depends on what comes back. How will the future forests regenerate after fire? Um, on public land where there is unlikely to be salvage logging or replanting, but it will be hotter and drier in the summertime. And how will this affect water? And what about private lands where there may be provisions of the forest accord, but also if those areas burn, there's likely to be salvage and replanting, and then everywhere there will be climate change. So I'd like to close by thanking the National Science Foundation, which has provided funding to the H.J. Andrews Long-Term Ecological Research Program since 1980 and supported my work, and also to the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station, which has supported hydrology measurements in experimental forests, and to very helpful conversations with many colleagues. So, thanks.
Wow. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Jones. I maybe I think I'm a little bit embarrassed about this, but I took a lot of photos of your slides.
I can give you the
I
talk.
was like, oh. So hopefully for you all, the audience, I hope that you also were in a position where you're like, oh my goodness, wait, I need a photo of that before she shifts to the next slide. Um, and we have a number of questions that are in the Q&A, as you might imagine, and some of them are highly technical and some of them are much bigger picture. But I'm going to take the liberty of asking kind of a softball one, but I really am curious about your scientific process around this. When you saw the data showing this water deficit relative of these plantation forests relative to old growth, did you believe it? I mean, what got you to the point where you felt just confident in this data? Because it's dramatic.
Yes, it is dramatic. You know, um, I'll tell a little bit of a story. I did publish a paper in 1996 about how old growth logging increased flooding. And uh, by chance, it was published a couple months before a really big flood. So then all he- all heck broke loose, and I was being attacked. Our paper was being attacked by my colleagues, and um, somebody paid some industry people to try to redo the analysis and show that it was wrong. But in that conversation, some a person from industry said, "Well, if floods were increasing this much, I would see it." And and you could say the same thing about low flows, right? If you're getting a 50% decrease in low flows, wouldn't you see it? Well, I think you probably only really see it if you're actually measuring the water that's coming out of a stream and you have long-term observations, which many people who depend on streams for their water may actually have. But it's not something that you can see without looking at the relationship and how the relationship with some kind of reference watershed changes over time. So I did believe it, but it took a while to think about why it was happening. Yeah.
Yeah, okay, thank you for indulging me in that one, but I appreciate that background to it. Um, I want to note that the first question from Deborah Fant is a big thank you to you for your research. It sounds like it's been very helpful to her community as they've worked on policy on an aerial spray ban campaign. So thank you for that. And then you can see the next question from Riley. Yeah. I'm going to read it for the listening viewers out there. I'm a reporter. I'm not a reporter. Riley is a reporter for the Chinook Observer in Washington's Pacific County, and currently working on a story about a planned timber sale on Department of Natural Resource, so state-owned land in the Lane and O'Connor Creek watersheds above the small town of Nassau, watersheds that much of the town gets their drinking water from. And some people in town have caught wind of the timber sale, which in its early pre-sale stages, and have gotten DNR to hold off at least until a community meeting can be held. So the question from Riley is, at roughly what age does a stand of mixed conifer, so Doug fir, hemlock, western red cedar, begin to transition from a period of transpiration intensive growth to a period of more efficient water use that characterizes the mature and old growth stands? So maybe coming back out of that water deficit. And the stand in question that the DNR wants to log is in the 60 to 70-year-old range. And depending upon who you ask in town, there are competing views as to how big of a role that stand plays in regulating summer low flow levels.
Yeah, that's a great question, and it's one we've wondered about. So the history of our region is that most of the native forests that were present when Europeans arrived regenerated after wildfire about 1500 of the current era, and then there was fire both due to climate and Euro in the mid 1800s. So, in the middle part of the last century, when these experiments were established, the reference forests had old growth or a mixture of old growth and 125 or 150-year-old trees, which are now 75 years older. But that's sort of symptomatic of much of the region. In other words, our whole landscape consists of these places where trees don't get to be more than 30 years old, or on the public lands, we have the plantations that are no older than 1950, because that's when the Forest Service opened up the public lands in the post World War II era to logging for timber production. But there are a couple things I think that the community could think about doing. One thing is that for sure, the logging will have the short-term effect. The logging of the 60 to 70-year-old plantation will have a short-term effect of increasing flows throughout the year, unless there are really big riparian buffers everywhere, in which case you might not get a big increase in summer flows, but you will get an increase in flow, annual flow. And then the question for most people in the early post logging period is, yeah, but and what, you'll get more water, but is it the water you want? Will it be water that also comes with a bunch of landslides from roads or
Mm,
other kinds of things? So I think the logging practices are important to pay attention to. Much of what we observed in the 50s, and well, I didn't observe it, but was observed in the 50s and 60s after logging of old growth forest. The roads may not have been well constructed, the culverts may not have been well designed, and
mm,
so logging practices that pay good attention to forest road conditions may be able to um, limit the deleterious effects of logging on post-logging drinking water quality
mhm.
while
Sure.
providing more water, but most of the increase in water will happen in the wintertime when you're probably not short on water. So then that relates to questions like, well, what kind of water storage facilities does the town have?
Yeah.
Does it have the capacity to store water to tide it over in the summertime? And then
Mhm.
the other question I would ask is there a potential for monitoring? Can there be some measurements set up in forests that aren't logged and forests that are logged, and look and see what happens?
Yeah.
There's a lot of community science these days, and um, we can always use more information.
That's great. I live in the Yamhill County, and up in the hills, we have a crew of citizen scientists led by an engineer, and she's worked with her neighbors, and so they all have their data, or they're getting their data loggers on their wells because they want to know what's happening in the groundwater. So I'm very proud of our neighbors for that. And Riley has another comment, but I'm going to keep working through the questions that are here. And there's two from Nancy Webster, so I'm going to ask them together, which is, can you discuss the relationship between deforestation and drought, including that increased temperatures? And then the other part is, if we let the deciduous trees return, and then allow natural succession, how does that relate to water quantity? So I think as opposed to reforesting.
Yeah. Okay. So deforestation, which is the removal of trees, increases water yield. So deforestation is a short-term counteraction to drought, though not one that I would recommend as a strategy. But I mean, that's how the processes work. But maybe that's not what Nancy meant. But I'll ask her to clarify if I didn't answer that. And then what about, instead of densely planted Douglas fir dominated stands, what if areas are allowed to regenerate naturally with whatever comes in? And in the Coast Range, if that's where Nancy is, you'll get a lot of alder and shrubs and conifers. And my guess would be that those um, would take a longer time to impose a deficit, right? Because you're going to have a surplus. It depends what you're taking away. It depends on what was there before. But if what was there before was a densely planted Douglas fir plantation, it seems to me that our long-term experiments indicate that if you were to remove that and replace that with natural succession, initially you would get a big surplus in water yield throughout the especially in the wet season, depending on what's in the riparian buffer. And then water yield might decline as forest returns, but maybe not as fast as it would decline if you're growing dense conifer forest. So maybe, I hope that's what she was wondering about.
Yeah, I think that was part of it. And Nancy is in the Coast Range. And I think there's a few other questions that are along these lines too of, um, are there other ways of managing the forest so that you don't get that, that the deficit, or if once you get the peak, what can you do to get to that 0 point of sorts? But I want to keep going through these because there's some really good questions in here. And thank you, Nancy, for that. Mary asks, what might firefighter, not fighter fire, firefighter training on trees and ecosystems include, especially when firefighters, often quite young, are brought in on short notice from all over the country? But I think it's a great question because it brings us back to something I had never thought about, is what is the role of the wildfire practices in forests of different ages?
Right, and this is pertinent to Riley's comment as well. And so, Riley, thank you for your work on fighting the Lookout Creek fire. And I didn't mean to disparage firefighters, because we are very much living in a culture where we have the Forest Service and we have a fire service, and the firefighters are in a sort of a little bit of a paramilitary operation, and you have you're sent places, and I don't know really how much uh, decision making individual firefighters are capable of making. And so I didn't mean to seem that I felt that firefighters were ignorant. However, some of the crews that were fighting the Lookout fire were from Utah and Nevada, and it was clear that they had never been in an old growth forest before. So I think it would be really interesting to hear your thoughts, maybe in response to Mary's question about what is the scope for engaging the whole structure of firefighting with questions about preserving ecological values. And these are very tough questions. They are not simple answers. I know that there is a lot of concern about human safety, and then that often means that trees that would not have been cut down in a pre-Euro fire situation get cut down, whether they're alive or dead. And so, and then the backfire is done very carefully, of course. It is intended not to produce a high severity burn. Nevertheless, though, I have been told that in the Cedar Creek fire near Waldo Lake, perhaps half of the area that was old growth that burned was part of the firefighting operation. And I don't have any independent verification of that. So it has led us to wonder, and because this fire occurred in an experimental forest where researchers will be really carefully looking at what happened, uh, these questions will continue to come up, and we hope to continue to work with our partners in the Willamette National Forest and beyond to talk about what are we learning as researchers about firefighting, as well as about the effects of fire on forests.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you. And this helps explain the very detailed question from Riley to start us off. So thank you for that. Um, we have a comment asking to tease out the relationships where riparian buffers do provide shade and amphibian habitat. They keep the water cooler. Isn't the weather pattern of less rain in the summer, more rain in the winter, and other factors more of a contributing factor than riparian buffers that are there? And I think I work on making sure that there are riparian buffers, so I feel you there. Can you tease out that relationship of the riparian buffer doing good, important work and versus the weather being a contributing factor?
Yeah, and maybe I can answer Kristen's question at sort of at the same time. So the purpose of a riparian buffer is, as you point out, to provide shade and over the longer term to contribute wood for structure in streams, to create aquatic habitat, retain sediment, and so forth. The question is, how many trees of what type do you need to create that function? And if the riparian buffer consists of essentially a plantation of uniform age of trees densely planted that are all Douglas fir, what we have been asked as researchers by the fish biologists in the Forest Service starting 15 years ago, after the, well, 20 years ago, after the Northwest Forest Plan, the fish bios started to ask what research could be done about thinning in riparian zones to see whether you can um, reduce the density of trees, which will reduce the sucking out of water, if you'll pardon the non-technical terms, while still maintaining the temperature and the wood additions that you need for aquatic habitat. And so there's a trade-off there somewhere. This is not about yes, riparian buffers, or no, it's about what should be in the riparian buffer in order to provide the benefits that are desired. And so why do streams with just a narrow buffer still continue to preserve stream flow deficits? Well, if you think about it, in the summertime, there's not a whole lot of water um, gradually seeping its way down the hill slopes toward the stream to come to your tap or to go to those fish that are in the stream in the summertime. And if there's a bunch, if there's just even a few very thirsty trees right there at the edge of the stream, and the water's coming down the hill slope, and then it gets into the rooting zone of those very thirsty trees before it gets into the stream, it's going to go up through the trees and out to the atmosphere rather than going into the stream. I hope that helped a little bit.
Yeah, I hope it helped. Thank you though for I think you took it on well, and it makes sense. I work on the private forest accord implementation, and one of the the term is the desired future condition, right? And the desired future condition of policy of the state of Oregon is to have a mature conifer forest there, an old conifer forest. And you're describing the process of getting there, right? So hopefully that's helpful. It was helpful to me. I know I grew up on the coast and I thought that we were supposed to have alders, but apparently it's good to have a little of everything there, a diverse stand.
Indeed. Yeah.
Okay. And thank you, Kristen, for that question as well. David asks, how did the recent fires in the H.J. Andrews affect the ongoing and the future research there? And thank you, because I was wondering the same thing, David.
David, thank you very much for your question. Well, it's transforming our research. We have a great many ideas of what we would like to do, but currently the researchers, are still not permitted back into the forest. It is closed. And the reason that it's closed is because of this question that maybe Riley, as a firefighter, also understands, which is that now that there's been a fire, there's a concern about danger trees and also other things like, oh, maybe there's still fire smoldering underground, or maybe there are these ghost stumps, places where fires burn through a root, and the soil is unstable. So we're waiting until the Forest Service completes a danger tree removal operation. And it was supposed to happen in May, but then they had to push it back because they couldn't cut a bunch of trees during an important wildlife season. So now maybe they'll do it in July, but oh, then that'll be fire season. So the answer is we have a bazillion questions. Most of the researchers haven't had a chance to get back out and reestablish our plots in places that burned. But we do have long-term records, and so we can already see that the recent fires have led to increases in stream flow, as you would expect, because of less evapotranspiration. And we can also begin to see how burned areas, how the air temperatures and the soil temperatures are changing in areas where the canopy is burned away versus places where it hasn't. So there are many, many questions, and it's going to take us a bunch of years to figure this out because this is a whole new world, and there's been no prior research on these topics. So come and join us.
All right, for those of you who are looking to do some more research,
Yeah.
I heard it. I heard it. Mary, this is similar to an earlier question, but I think it's teasing out this question more. The research question, hopefully, is that are there similar deficits, water deficits in forests that have been harvested but regenerated through natural ecological succession? And it's something I wondered when you were showing that, and maybe you don't have the information because you don't have a paired watershed.
There are no paired watershed experiments that allowed natural ecological succession in the Pacific Northwest, but over on the East Coast, where their summers are not dry, so they don't have the low summer season, they did have paired watershed experiments where the native mixed hardwood forest was allowed to regenerate. And in those watersheds also, they saw that the young forest tended to use more water over time as it grew compared to the older forest. And there is still the question that was asked earlier by was it
Nancy?
was by Riley about, well, how old so this relates to, well, what's your reference? If your reference is 150 to 500-year-old forest, does a forest start to behave like a 150-year-old forest when it's 100 years old? And we don't know because that's sort of a missing age class for us. So to anonymous attendee, I would say generally it seems to be the case that younger forests, because they are growing rapidly, have a tendency to use more water than older forests. But how long, but exactly what those ages are is we don't have enough record. We have gaps in the ages, so in our paired watershed experiments. So.
Great. That is super helpful, even if it's we don't know, but here's why we don't know, right? And Mary asks, what about the chemical load and runoff due to herbicides? Is that something that your research looked at in other places rather than just the paired watershed?
No, I haven't examined that. There is a lot of research on the use of herbicides, but I am not the person to ask about that. When you're a professor, you have to just say, I'm sorry, I don't know. I could try looking it up and writing to you. So,
Yeah,
very,
yeah,
very,
definitely. And Mary, we can get you more information. Actually, there are a number of people who are attending this right now who can get you that information. So that's the true thing. Um, and then Trigby Steen asks, or it's kind of a question, I think it's a clarification, is when you mention water yield, is that most people are concerned about summer flow rather than winter flow. What concerns, would you have? I can think of a number around the peak winter flow.
oh, right. Thank you for that uh, clarification. So water yield, when hydrologists use that term, it's average annual flow. But in this part of the world, what we really want is we want not too much water in the winter where there's a lot of rain and snow, but we want more water in the summer when there's not a lot of rain or snow. And so the old growth forest is great because it seems to have the capacity to limit high flows when water is abundant, but also to provide more water when water is scarce. And when we replace the old forest with plantations, we get this, which is we get more water when we don't need it and less water when we might want it.
And I will say just a comment that came into the Q&A from Regna is exactly that high flow is often accompanied or seems to be accompanied by turbidity issues, soil in the water. Yeah.
I'd love to, maybe Casey, you could save the chat so I can read Riley's comments at more length. And
Yeah,
Riley, I'm Julia Jones at OregonState.edu. If you want to write to me and have a conversation, I'd love to learn more about what you experienced while fighting that fire and what we might learn from your experience.
yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Um, and then I think we've covered, I just want to check. I think we've covered pretty well.
What about Pat
Oh my gosh, did I miss?
at the bottom?
Oh, maybe I missed
Pat,
Pat. Oh, thank you.
Pat, I think Pat has been fighting BLM for a long time. Um, so the there is this belief that riparian buffers solve all our problems. And the answer is, well, just putting any old riparian buffer isn't going to solve all your problems. It might protract some of the problems. And so focusing the discussion on what is in the riparian buffer and what is the desired condition of the riparian buffer to produce the desired combination of cool temperature, wood additions, sediment retention, and flow is is a work in progress. I think collectively we're all trying to figure out what that would be. We are getting closer to implementing a second phase in a paired watershed experiment in the Umpqua National Forest, in which there is a plantation that's about 50 years old, where what we're going to do first is cut the trees in the riparian buffer. Because it's an experimental forest, we can do this. We're going to cut the trees in the riparian buffer, which are 45-year-old Douglas fir. We're going to cut those trees and see what happens. We're going to leave them on the ground, and so they'll become large wood. And we're going to see how much of a difference it makes. And then the forest plantation will be thinned in this 60-hectare watershed. And then the forest plantation will be thinned. And the forest biologists will have an opportunity to look at this non-fish bearing stream and see what happens to water yield, what happens to stream temperature, what happens to wood. And maybe we can get a little closer to figuring out how to design riparian buffers that will achieve our goals. And people have
That's,
been on for a long time. I appreciate
I know.
people staying
Thank
past.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you all. I do have one. There was the nagging question, and it's probably part of a longer conversation, Dr. Jones. But if a landowner either purchases or has a forest that is clearly by your, if it is representative of the plantation forests, what do you have a science-based recommendation for them if they're concerned about stream flow in the summer and then their highs and their lows? Can they manage it differently, or is it still, do they just have to wait it out?
Well, I see this very cryptic remark from Jeffrey at the bottom: clear cut or thin. So
Oh,
if you're a small private woodland owner and you have an even age stand that you inherited from a previous episode of something, the policy on the public forest lands has been now for 25 or 30 years to manage stands to try to promote the kinds of varied ages and species and structures that we believe contribute to increasing biodiversity while also allowing carbon to accumulate and to the forest structure to moderate uh, flows. So a simple answer is, if you don't need to get a bunch of revenue, use judicious selective thinning to promote structural development of a forest that also, and leave dead wood if you can on the ground, and try to promote uh, biodiversity and carbon storage, because in the process of doing that, you'll also get the more regulated flows from that patch of land.
Well, that was really a wonderful way to end it, because I felt like there's some real hope here. Uh, and thank you to all of you who've asked great questions and provided the perspective that each of you has. Thank you, Dr. Jones, for sharing your science with us over a lifetime of research. And, I really appreciate that you noted the researchers who set up these long-term ecological research projects. What a legacy that they've brought through for the rest of us, so that we know what's actually happening out there. If you are in a watershed or near a watershed and you're concerned about it, or you have a watershed that you manage, reach out to me, Casey Kula at Oregon Wild. And I'm working on a coalition to really look deeply at how we change practices, both incentives and regulation, in order to have secure drinking water for everybody, that's really based on the research that Dr. Jones has done. So thank you all so much, and have a good evening out there.
Thank you very much.